There are lots of different ways in mnemonics, how people remember and how they're taught to remember, that a negative times a negative is always a positive. But my question for you today is, why is that? Did someone just make up some crazy rule and we all follow it? Or is there a way that we can understand this conceptually? I'd like to use integer chips today to try and explain why a negative times a negative is always a positive. Let's start with an example problem of -3 times -5. Part of being able to explain this conceptually is we need to remember that this negative sign can also be thought as the opposite of. I'm going to go ahead and instead of thinking of this as -3 times -5, I'm going to think of this as the opposite of 3 groups of -5. If you're wondering why am I allowed to pull that outside of the parentheses, remember that to get -3, I can actually think about multiplying 3 times -1. And I know that because of the commutative property of multiplication, I can switch the order of these and it actually doesn't matter. Likewise, I could think of this problem as -1 times 3 times -1 times 5. I can think of it that way as well. And because of the commutative property, I know that I can switch those numbers around and the order doesn't matter when I'm multiplying. So now let's go ahead and think about how we would draw 3 groups of -5 chips. As you can see, I went ahead and put 3 groups of -5 chips on the board. Notice that this is not 5 groups of -3 chips. That's actually a very different way to conceptually think about that, even though you're going to get the same answer. So 3 groups of -5. And then what I want to do is hit this opposite of button up here on the virtual manipulatives. And you can see that it changes them all to a positive. Now you may be thinking, but does that work for every number? Let's explore it with just some variables. When I think of this with just -a times -b, again, I can always think of it as the opposite of A groups of negative chips. Well, no matter what my numbers are, if I'm taking the opposite of some negative chips, I know that that's going to turn them all positive. This is why a negative times a negative is always a positive. I hope that gives you a little bit more insight into the math that's really happening behind that rule that you may have memorized, and that you now have a better understanding of why a negative times a negative is always a positive.